Hi everyone, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and it's time for part 2 on the Schliemann, part 3 in our series on the quick Ruy Lopez. And I regret to say that this is probably going to be part 2 of 3 on the Schliemann, but there's a lot of material. Okay, so last time we looked at everything except for knight to c3, so this time, naturally, we're going to look at knight to c3. Now here black has 3 moves, but I'm going to say basically nothing about 2 of them. So 2 moves that are interesting but not considered to be fully sound are knight f6 and knight to d4. And in both cases it's thought that if white just takes this pawn greedily on f5, so either knight d4 he takes f5 or knight f6 he takes f5, that white should be able to maintain this pawn and fare well. And in fact he's got a pretty hefty plus in these lines. So here for instance in the knight f6 e takes f5 line, white scores about 67%, and in the knight to d4, e takes f line, it's about, well, it's over 70%. So, you know, you can check it out as a surprise weapon, but obviously with scores like that, it's not really surprising many people. So I would really not advocate that if you're interested in the Schliemann. Okay, so f takes e4. This is the real move. Knight takes e4, pardon me, and now there's a big parting of the ways here. Two huge branches. So there's the older branch with d5, which will be our focus today, and there's also knight f6, which we'll look at a little bit. We'll kind of outline that and look at one of the sidelines later on in this particular recording. But our focus is going to be on d5 here. Alright, so on d5, white plays knight takes e5, d takes e4, and the main move here by an overwhelming margin is knight takes c6, and then we've got 2 more branches to look at, queen d5 and queen to g5. But before we get to knight takes c6, you might wonder, well, why not queen to h5 check? I mean, this looks like it should be terrific. I mean, you know, the black king's exposed, he's got almost no development. The rook on h8 might drop, so why not go for this? Well, it's as we'll see, it's just not so good. And generally speaking, I mean, these lines where white goes for the rook in the corner doesn't really work out very well for him. Okay, so here g6 is forced, but perfectly good. Takes, and here of course queen e5 check is pointless. We can just take the rook straight away. So we take it, and now black has 2 equally good options, I think. So you can simply play bishop to e6, and this is about equal. Black has just 2 knights for the rook and 2 pawns, but the rook and the pawns play no role, no meaningful role at this point. So black is doing quite well, and in practice I think black scores very well in all of these variations. Let me see. Yeah, okay, not so many games there, but black has done very well. The trickier line, which I would recommend, is queen f6. And you don't lose anything by going for this. So if white correctly trades queens, then again, black is in quite good shape with the 2 knights for the rook and 2 pawns. If white were to play bishop takes c6, that would be even worse. I think the black light square bishop would be very active, and this would more than compensate for the problems with the pawn structure. The trap is if white plays queen takes g8. And it doesn't really look as if this should be really a problem. I mean, it's going to take a black rook a long time to get to a square like h8, for instance, and of course the white queen is also threatening to just escape on the diagonal. But as it turns out, this just doesn't work out for white. So bishop to e6, queen, or you can take first, doesn't matter, and then queen h7. And the problem is that after black castles queenside, it's not that he's going to get to play bishop g7 or bishop d6 or something like that, and then, well, not d6 because then queen h6 and the queen escapes, but bishop g7, rook h8. That isn't the problem. Rather, it's that black is threatening rook to d7, and you can see that the bishops and the queen and the pawn on g6 have all the h-file escape squares covered. So this just wins. So queen takes g8 here is a blunder. White has to go for this, but again, this promises white nothing at all. So knight takes c6 is the right way to go. And as I said, there are 2 big branches here, queen d5 and queen g5. Let's start with queen to d5, which is a slightly older-fashioned move. Okay, here white plays c4, has to do this. Now queen to d6, and now again we have a parting of the ways. There's knight takes a7 check, and there's queen h5 check. Now queen h5 check I think might be more common. Let me take a quick look here. No, knight takes a7 is more common. So okay, it's both better and more common. So let's see queen h5 check though. So the idea is that after g6, queen e5 check, white gets to swap off the queens. He's a pawn up. Should be good, right? Well, very often you'll see in the Schliemann this pawn on e4 is a terrific cramping pawn. It really impedes white's development, and if he exchanges it off, well, it's not so easy to always exchange it very, very easily either. The pawn on c4 creates these holes on the d file. The white minor pieces on the queen side are kind of clumsy, so it looks like black can equalize. Now, as I mentioned, very often it's no big deal for black to sack this rook in the corner, but here it's not the best. If king f7, white could play c5, and this should be advantageous for him, but he can also just grab the rook. After b takes c6, queen h7, bishop g7, bishop a4, bishop e6, again c5, and then castles. It seems as if white's extra material should give him a big advantage. Maybe winning in the long run. Okay, there's too much work to be done to really call this a winning position, but certainly it's very doubtful that black really has adequate or even nearly adequate compensation for the material investment. So king f7 here is really not such a great idea. So black should just trade queens, and this is actually fine. Knight e5, check, c6, and now white must play bishop to a4. It's important to know this little trick. Black often can use this in the Schliemann. So after knight takes c6, it might look as if white has run away with the second pawn, but in fact he hasn't. Black has this little trick, a6, bishop a4, and then bishop to d7. And now the knight can't escape without the bishop on a4 dropping. Note that you have to play that first. Even if that pawn weren't on c4, let's say the pawn was back on c2. If you play bishop to d7, white has knight to d4, and the knight protects the bishop. So that's why you drive him back first, and then bishop to d7, winning a piece. So that's why white must refrain from taking that pawn and play bishop to a4. Okay, now bishop to g7, d4, e takes d3 en passant, bishop f4, knight f6. Okay, and white can either castle first and take the pawn second, or take the pawn first and castle second. Okay, it comes to the same thing. Now, here you might think that white is just fine. I mean, no real targets, up a pawn. Black doesn't even enjoy the bishop pair. But in fact, this seems to be equal, and black even has a plus score in this position. So the knight on d3 is kind of clumsy. Rook to d4 might be in the air. If the knight runs away, knight to e4 could be kind of awkward. So black is in fact enjoys extreme activity here. His pieces are all beautifully placed, and again, black has full compensation for the pawn at this point. So it may not look like it to you, but practice has shown that this really is the case. And so for that reason, going back, since this line is fairly forcing, queen h5 check is not as popular or as successful as the greedy knight takes a7 check. All right, well now bishop to d7, takes, queen h5 check. If knight to b5, just rescuing the knight immediately, then knight f6. And although white's up 2 pawns, black seems to have full compensation here. All these weak squares on the d file again really help him a lot. I mean, black's going to put the bishop on c5, or play c6 and sometimes bishop to d6, but bishop c5 is certainly natural. The queen might go to d3 at some point. Black has a lot of open files for his rooks. That's one of the advantages of losing or sacrificing pawns. You get some open lines for the rooks, and it's really quite difficult for white to unravel and start making some progress. So instead of knight to b5, white should play queen to h5 check. And there's some funny lines here. For instance, if king to d8, which is playable, white plays queen to a5, so swings to the other side, threatening knight to c6 check. Black brings the king back to e8, and I guess white could go for perpetual if he really wanted to, but he's a little bit better. So queen to e5 check, king f7, knight to b5, c6, And now, after either queen to d4 first, with the idea of playing knight to c3 next, or knight to c3 straight away, white's probably a little bit better, which means that black probably doesn't have 2 full pawns worth of compensation. But it's not that bad for black either. So black can certainly play this position, but objectively speaking, it may not be full compensation for the material. Alternatively, black can play g6. And after queen e5 check, king f7, this time taking the rook is not so good. After knight f6, black will just bring the rook to e8 and play bishop to g7 and be in good shape. Notice that if white tries something like b3 here to play bishop to b2, black will have queen to d4. Right, so this hits the rook, and if rook to b1, then maybe queen to d3 could prove kind of unpleasant as well. So white really can't easily get the queen out of the corner, and so this should be okay for black. So it's better to play knight to b5, hitting the c pawn, and saving the knight, of course. c6, queen d4, which is very similar to what we saw before, but in the earlier version, the pawn wasn't on g6, so there was no rook in the corner trick. All right, now here, black should probably be modest and play knight to f6. Just allow the trade of queens, and again, even in this position, even though white's up a pawn, and it's going to be 2 pawns in a moment when he regains the pawn on f3, even this gives black some fair counterplay. Perhaps we move the king out of the way, and then if rook takes f3, all right, I don't know if knight to b3 is good there, but it might be. Might be interesting to play like that, and then bishop to c5 check. Maybe I'm not sure. So it's unclear. I mean, black certainly has some trumps here. I don't know if it's 2 pawns worth of trumps, but it isn't entirely clear that this is over either. So I think this would need some further investigation, and probably black is safer playing this. Going back here, black is probably safer in this king to d8 line than in the g6 line. Okay, alternatively, going back here, I said that black should be modest and play knight f6. If he keeps the queens on here with queen to e7, now white can take the rook in the corner. So queen h8, knight f6, and here b3, because now there's no queen d4 business. And even queen e5 is not quite as impressive, because after rook to b1, there's no queen to d3. So it's quite a bit different now. Black will round up the white queen. However, in this position, white has an awful lot for it. So white has 2 rooks and 2 pawns for the queen. Okay, there's also the knight versus bishop imbalance. The big problem for black is that all he has are these diagonal pieces, and there's nothing that they can really coordinate to attack. Well, okay, the queen is of course more than a diagonal piece, but the bishop is just a diagonal piece. And the only targets that the bishop could really have would be f2 and d2, both of which are extremely easy to defend. So white's just going to castle next, and I think this should be a routine win for white. Maybe, okay, if queen d4 you play maybe, well, yeah, you just castle, and I think give up the d-pawn and play knight takes e4. So I think this is probably losing in the long run for black. Also, white doesn't have to take the rook, but can play knight to c3. Say knight f6, castles, and I don't think that black has 2 pawns worth of compensation here. So it'll take white a little time to unravel, but there aren't really any big targets in his position, so he should have time to emerge more or less unscathed with at least 1 extra pawn and a good position. Okay, so queen d5, I think. If white knows what he's doing and plays this, plays c4 and then the greedy knight takes a7 check, I think white should obtain an edge. Not a winning advantage, but certainly a better position. So there's queen g5, and this is a more interesting line and perhaps better too. Okay, white plays queen e2 here, and now black plays knight f6. So there's a little trick that you should know, and it's unfortunate for black, but queen takes g2 cannot be played. So this is just a blunder, as appealing as it might appear at first sight. The reason why it's a blunder is that now for once queen h5 check is not only good, it's devastating. What can be done here? If the king moves to d7, probably if nothing else, knight to e5 check looks quite strong. Actually, let me see. Yeah, there's a lot of tempting looking moves there. Even knight a7 might be playable. Knight e5, as I said, looks good. Maybe queen d5 check. Maybe queen f5 check. I mean, yeah, this is pretty gruesome looking. Yeah, I have a feeling queen f5 might be best. Anyway, if okay, so that leaves g6. Oh, and if queen g6, of course, knight to e5 is discovered check, winning the queen. So this is horrible. This can't be done for black. So that leaves g6, and now queen to e5 check. And what does black do? If he blocks with something, then knight takes e7 check is winning at least a piece. If he plays king to d7, then knight to b8 is double check, and then queen to e8 is mate. So that's no winner. And if king to f7, knight to d8 is mate. Moral of the story, do not play queen takes g2 here. Okay, so the right move is knight f6. And now queen takes g2 is a threat. All right, so here the main move is f4. But in the comments to last week's show, Nimzo BG mentioned the knight takes a7 check line, which is also known. It's a lot rarer, but it seems to be pretty decent as well. And I certainly don't see any way for black to achieve equality after this, although it's really not that bad either. Okay, so let's start with a poor move, relatively speaking, c6. On this, knight takes c6 is quite okay. If queen g2, then knight e5 check, and then queen to f1. Black really doesn't have anything going for him here. It's a big advantage for white. Okay, alternatively there's bishop to d7, knight to d4, so the trick that I mentioned before, queen takes g2, bishop takes d7, king d7, and rook f1. And black needs another pawn. If you can give him his c-pawn back, everything would be okay, but it's a little too airy over there, and two pawns, I don't think black has 2 pawns worth of compensation. So c6 is not the answer. Bishop to d8, king to d8 is a reasonable move. Knight c8, queen g2. Here the old line was rook f1, and even this is probably good for a very slight edge, although I think it's fairly close to equality. After king takes f3, e takes f3, takes, rook g1. And white's going to win the extra pawn back, but black is going to have very nice development. His rooks get into play right away. The white king is going to be awkward, not in the sense that it's going to get mated, but tending to it with all these open files is going to tie white's pieces down just a little bit. So this is actually pretty reasonable for black. All right, queen f1 is a better try, and it's been played and also mentioned by Nimzo BG in his comment. Okay, queen f3, keeping the queen on is not so good. White returns the piece straight away to mess up black's pawns. And yeah, white has a pretty nice advantage here. Extra pawn and a decent position. So probably better to trade queens, but this actually is okay. White is, of course, a little bit better here with the bishop pair and an extra pawn, but if you look and see what white's extra pawn is, it's this passed a pawn, and that's not going to be so easy to really create a meaningful passer over there. That's going to be quite difficult. The f2 pawn is a weakness. So yeah, white is a little bit better, but it's not quite as worrisome as you might think. So certainly I'd rather have white than black here, but I wouldn't be too scared yet if I were black. Okay, alternatively, there's bishop to d7 after knight takes a7 check. So now takes, and here f4 is a good move. If queen takes e4 check, so it's worth looking at this for a second, because this puts white 3 pawns up, and he can even make it 4 pawns with queen takes b7. But black actually has more than enough compensation even after the 3rd pawn. Here, white could even be in trouble. Black has rook takes a7. Now, if white doesn't take, well, then, black has at least a piece for the 4 pawns, and is going to have very nice development. He's going to have the initiative here. So let's look at queen takes a7. Well, on this, queen g2 is big trouble. All right, rook f1 is the only move that makes much sense here, although it's in fact a mistake, objectively. So now after bishop to c5, rook e8 check is next. And after queen to a6, well, bad news is rook e8 check. And if king to d1, then queen to f3 is mate next move. So queen e2 is forced, takes, and materially speaking, it's roughly equal. White has 2 rooks and 3 pawns for a queen and a knight. You can even think of that as +1 on some counts, but after knight to e5, I think that white is going to get dismembered here. So all of the black pieces are involved. None of the white pieces are. So this is bad news for white. Black is winning here. Okay. So after knight takes d7, instead of the greedy queen e4 check, white should play the more generous f4, returning one of the pawns, or offering to return one of the pawns here to open some lines, make sure that g2 is okay, and and also to maybe displace the black queen somewhat. Well, here the best move is queen to c5, though other moves have been played. This is a position that's been known for a long time. Knight b5, queen takes c2, d4, and again, this is still known. And here black has a couple of reasonable options. I mean, you could just trade queens straight away and play bishop to d6. And again, it's easy to overestimate this kind of position for white, but in fact, it's very difficult for white to win. So obviously, white's the one who's going to be trying, but with these pawns on dark squares, for instance, f4, d4, b2, this bishop is not really so terrific, and black is going to go for some kind of blockade like this. The knight will be very strong there. It can't be removed. And again, it's not an easy position for white to break black down at all. Similarly, instead of queen e2, black could play this check first. Okay, it doesn't really make too much difference. And again, we get to the same kind of position. The knight's gonna maneuver around to d5. At least that's a typical plan. And it's not at all an easy win for white at all. It's not even close to a win at this point. So yeah, white's better. Black is playing to hold the position, but this is not that easy for white at all. So I would not play this and assume it's just a matter of time. It's not so easy at all. Okay, well that said, it's certainly not bad for white. All right, so knight takes a7 check is definitely a playable move. But the main move, though, is f4. And now, sometimes black plays queen h4 check, but I think it's widely accepted that just queen takes f4 is best. Now, here too, well, the main line is knight e5 check, but here too, knight takes a7 can be played. All right, after this, bishop to d7, takes, queen b5 check, king e6. And here, white has tried a whole host of moves. Well, okay, maybe not that big a host, but queen b7 and queen to b3. So sometimes after queen to b3, you can have queen takes b7 now. You could have queen to b5 check, just repeating the position. And you can also have queen to f7. So white has a whole bunch of ways to go jumping around with the queen. You can explore that on your own. I'll just look at one line here with queen takes b7, which is the main move. So the main line continues bishop to d6, queen to b3 check, king to d7. And again, I think black has pretty good compensation for the 2 pawns. Maybe not full compensation, but it's not bad either. Queen f7 check, king d8, knight c6 check, king c8, knight e7, takes, rook e8, queen c5, and then rook to a6. And this has actually occurred quite a bit. And black has scored very well here. I mean, I'm not even sure that I would say that white has an advantage, despite the fact that white has 2 extra pawns in his pocket here. But you know, where's this king going, first of all? If he plays something like rook to f1 to at least get the queen out of there, well, then queen takes h2 is happening. The black king is perfectly safe, even though he's just got the fig leaf there on c7 in front of him. White has nothing else that he's attacking with, right? There's just the queen, but the queen has no help, and meanwhile, all of black's pieces are in the act. So this is not at all an easy position for white, and in fact, I think black has a plus score here. So while knight takes a7 is playable, it's not a free lunch or a free pawn. Okay, knight e5 check. This is the main move. c6, d4, protecting the knight, attacking the black queen. Queen h4 check, g3, queen h3, and now white has time to save his bishop, which he promptly puts on e6, on c4, pardon me. Black neutralizes this diagonal with bishop to e6. And here, white sometimes plays bishop to f4, but the most common move is bishop to g5. And now, okay, black either castles first or plays bishop to d6 first. It almost invariably transposes. And here, white has tried at least three moves, and all three of these are somewhat important. Okay, line 1, grab the bishop here with knight to f7. So takes and takes. And at first glance, again, this might seem like it should be really good for white. He's got the bishop here, the pawn on e4 is isolated and probably weak. Shouldn't white be better here? Well, I don't know if he should or shouldn't be, but in terms of practice, it doesn't seem that he is. Rook h to f8, bishop c4, rook d to e8. Now the pawn on e4 is perfectly fine. Both black rooks are already in play. Rook h to f1, h6, so putting the question to this bishop. Bishop f4, which is the best square for the bishop, but at least now black can eliminate the bishop pair. Okay, rook e7, and I think black has no real problems. The most aggressive move here is d5. So takes, rook f to e8, and the e-pawn again is adequately defended. The black king is fine. He's just going to go to b8 next move and get out of the breeze. And black is done perfectly fine here. For instance, bishop to b3, king b8, and black has scored well in this position, or from this position. Okay, so knight f7, while it makes good sense, really hasn't gotten anywhere. Okay, another approach has been queen f1. Obviously, queen takes f1 is impossible because of bishop takes e6 check. And additionally, there's the threat now from white of playing queen takes h3 and then knight to f7. Also, there's the threat to take the knight on f6. So at first, this might seem a little bit scary, but tactics to the rescue. Rook h to e8. Okay, so choice time for white. He can either play bishop takes f6, or he can grab the bishop here. Let's start by looking at white grabbing the bishop here. Queen h3, bishop h3, knight f7, rook to d7, takes. All right, well, once again, you might at first think that this should be great for white with the bishops and the potentially weak pawn on e4, but once again, black is able to hold everything just fine. Bishop f4, rook d7, rook h to e1, bishop g4, rook d2, and now knight to d5. Okay, bishop e5. And the pawn is in danger, but after e3, it seems that he's okay. Probably best now is rook to g2. It's equal. Maybe white is microscopically better, but black is fine. Alternatively, white might try rook to d3, aiming to just win this pawn straight away, get this sucker off the board. Well, now black plays knight to b6, e2, and a5. So we get some counterplay here. Now c5 again, aiming to bother this bishop. And notice that, of course, white cannot take on c5 because rook to d1 would be mate in 2. So c3, c4, and black is quite okay. Bishop goes back to c2, then the knight goes to d5, and it's just beautiful there. And well, actually, there might even be some problems with the white rook as well. So this is quite all right for black. Black is doing just fine. Okay, so back here, we just looked at queen h3 and then knight f7. All right, alternatively, there's bishop takes f6. Winning a pawn? No. Queen h6 check. King b1, queen f6. Okay, so now we end up with still another version of this knight f7, knight d6 stuff, but here it's just regaining the bishop, so to speak. Well, black is fine after either rook to f8 or rook to d7. It's just equal. Black, maybe the his f-pawn is slightly weak, but too slightly for it to matter. Black can also pressure the d-pawn. And I mean, after, let's say, takes, and rook e takes d6 of c3, then there's c5. So black has no worries here at all. So queen f1 doesn't seem to be any more successful than knight to f7 when it comes to giving white an advantage here. Finally, there's bishop takes e6, queen e6, and then queen to c4. Okay, well here, rook h to e8, queen e6, rook e6, knight f7. And now black should be a little bit accurate here. If he plays, for instance, rook d to e8, then after takes, pawn takes, knight h6. So not knight takes bishop, but knight h6 followed by knight f5. And here white does stand a little bit better. So the black structure is compromised. This knight is terrific. The black bishop is not very good. But instead of rook d to e8, if black plays rook to d7, then he's perfectly fine. So here, if bishop takes f6, rook takes f6 is quite okay, or maybe even rook takes f7, frankly, might be even better. So white probably has nothing better than just to grab the bishop, and this position again seems to be equal, despite the bishop versus knight and the isolated e4 pawn. Okay, so it looks as if, as far as I can tell, white does not gain an advantage in this main line with knight to e5 check. So perhaps that knight takes a7 here, or even better, knight takes a7 on move 9. Maybe this is the best try for white. So it's very messy, but perhaps this is the way to go. Okay, so that is 5d5 and all that I want to say about that. So now let's go to knight f6. Okay, here there are two big moves. There's knight takes f6 check, and there's queen to e2. All right, and we'll get to all of this next time, but I'm going to show you one line just to get a side line out of the way, and it's in this queen e2 system. So queen e2, d5, and now instead of the main move, which is knight takes f6, let's take a quick peek at knight to g3. So here we have a greedy line for white. White is playing this most of the time to just snap up the pawn on e5. And a move like e4 would not be very good here. I think white just plays d3, and the pawn is still going to drop. So the right move here is bishop to d6. White plays knight takes e5, otherwise it's not really clear what in the world he's doing. And black castles. And now white should take on c6. The question is which way? Well, let's look at both. All right, let's start with the obvious move. Knight takes c6, bc, bishop c6, and rook to b8. And here, white is up 2 pawns, and after he castles, he doesn't have to worry about rook to e8 tricks. But nevertheless, black has really very good compensation here. Rook to b6, bishop a4, and now knight to g4. And you can see that the black army is really loaded for bear here. Ready to play queen h4, bishop might come to c5, the rook might go from b6 to f6, or even to h6, and there's just going to be tremendous pressure here, and white also has to be aware that maybe bishop to a6 could occur in some variations too, or after h3 there might be lines where the bishop ends up taking on h3. So black's pieces are all perfectly placed for kingside attack. All right, just to show one line, let's say white plays h3, which is not the best move, but it's a very natural move. Against this, black is probably winning. Bishop takes g3. Okay, 2 captures are possible here. If h takes g4, black wins like this. Bishop h2 check, then queen h4, then rook to h6. Okay, f3 to give the king a flight square. But now after queen h2 check, king f2, bishop takes g4, and white is getting massacred here. If he tries to step out of the way with king to e3, then a rook goes to the e file, well, rook to e6 check wins the queen, and with more to follow. Rook takes f3 is threatened here, bishop takes f3 is threatened here. White is lost. Okay, so going back here, after h3, bishop takes g3, white should play f takes g3, but even here, black is winning with rook to e6. For instance, queen to d1, rook takes f1, queen takes f1, and now the key idea, queen to e7, and white cannot defend his first rank. After h takes g4, rook e1, the material situation is not so bad in and of itself. It's going to be, white's going to have, excuse me, a rook, bishop, and 2 pawns for the queen. But all right, first of all, the g pawns are not long for this world. But more importantly, the white's development is well, it's practically non-existent here. So black is going to be able to keep attacking even after cashing in on the queen. So this is a winning position for black as well. Okay, so that's a pretty good reason not to play knight takes c6. Again, it wasn't forced. White does not have to play h3 here, but it's very easy for him to lose quickly, and I don't think there's any line where he's actually better. Okay, bishop takes c6 is a better try, but here too black is fine. B takes c6, And now white should castle. You cannot take this pawn on c6 because after queen to d7 you've got no defense to rook e8. So if knight e5, just takes and then rook e8. Okay, so castles, rook e8, or I should say there's no defense to rook e8 there that didn't involve losing the knight. Okay, so here white has time for d4, but black just takes his shots at this construction here. So c5, and now white can play a couple of reasonable moves. There's bishop to g5 and queen f3, but in both cases black is doing great. If bishop to g5, then Brunello gives the following line, which seems to be perfectly sound and very logical. h6, takes, c3, and now we just take once on d4 and we play c5 all over again. And this setup is not really very good for white, obviously. And black has two very good bishops. Clearly, black has no problems here. This is at least equal. All right, instead of bishop to g5, there's also queen f3, offering to give the pawn back a couple of different ways. And the way that black should regain it is not by playing bishop takes e5, but simply c takes d4. Now, this allows white to keep the extra pawn, but after, for instance, rook to b8, getting off the diagonal, and at least making white have to deal with the possible rook takes b2 before he develops his bishop, let's say knight d to e5, and then bishop to e5 is a line given by Postny. And black is at least equal here, maybe even a little bit better, despite the one pawn deficit. So the black bishops are beautiful, he's got a better center, he's ahead in development. The white knights are maybe even a little bit awkward here. There's pressure against b2. So black is in terrific shape here. No worries at all. Very good position for white. For black, excuse me. Not such a good position for white. Although, white's not in trouble yet, but certainly this is an easier position for black to play. And I think, objectively speaking, black is at least equal. Okay, so this takes us to everything except for, again, the main lines, which are after queen e2, d5, knight takes f6, check, gf, d4, bishop g7, d takes e5, castles, and now there's bishop takes c6, and there's e6. Okay, so these are the main lines within the queen to e2 system. And then there's also knight takes f6, check, queen takes f6, and then from here we have to deal with castles. That's one line, and then the queen to e2, bishop e7 takes lines. All right, so that'll keep us busy next week. Hope you enjoyed this, and maybe sorry if you're not a Schliemann fan that it's going so long, but I know this system pretty well, so I'm giving you a pretty thorough coverage of this. You'll be ready to play it or to face it, certainly, in your own games after this. All right, so thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye-bye.